Oh, Dr. Arkinson.
Yes.
I have a funny thing to show you real quick.
Oh, no.
This is funny. This was in oral skills yesterday.
We have a very
Elizabeth,
good
right next to me, you know, and she messaged me as we were learning, and she says, in quotes, "Okay, haha, Doc Hawk, every time you speak." Which now that I think about it, every time I say something that's like not normal, you go, "Okay, haha, anyway." It's true. And it's not a bad thing, because you're always trying to get back to teaching us.
All right.
But I just thought it was really funny.
All right. Okay,
Don't tell her I told you that, she'll be mad.
I've got nothing to return to you today because I didn't collect anything last time, but I am going to be collecting something this time.
Damn.
So if you'll take out your workbooks and open up to page 38, we'll take a look at some of the problems there. Before you raise any questions that you may have, I do want to give you a reminder, or a hint, I guess I could say, for this first section C, number 6. Take a look at section C, number 6. Do you see there that they're asking for you to spell a major 5 or dominant chord in a minor key? What have I said in the past several classes that you need to do to one of the notes in that major 5 chord in a minor key?
Raise the husband.
That's right. You gotta find whatever scale degree 7 is of the key. It'll be in that chord somewhere. And you gotta raise it by a half step with an accidental. So if we're in E minor, what note pitch letter name is scale degree 7?
D.
D, that's right. So you should have a D in your 5 chord somewhere in section C, number 6, and then you should raise that D with a sharp. Raise it with an accident. Say again?
Why are we doing a second chord there?
We're not doing a 7 chord, we're doing a 5
Fifth.
chord.
You have to raise the 7.
Okay, you mean like those literal.
This-
Wait, what?
Yeah, you have to raise the 7th degree of the scale,
Okay, of the scale, that's, yeah.
Which is
You go, wait, what?
which is going to be the 3rd of the chord.
Okay, yeah, gotcha.
Third.
What is going on? That's your guys in building a second.
Just Wednesday afternoon.
No, you don't need to build a 7th chord.
It's any of the chords that have a 7.
Gotcha.
So
The moral of the story is there should be a D in that chord and you can put a sharp
Because
on
we
it.
deal with harmonic minor scale.
That's the moral.
Roger that.
Yeah.
Yep.
You missed
It did not have to be before. Okay. All right, so there's my reminder for the day. Let's see if you have any questions about anything, section C or D, that you'd like to see before I go over this.
Yeah, no.
Is there nothing
I
else?
slept on the stairs and left my music book there, so.
Nice. I felt pretty good about today.
Because that's where I decided to sleep. Get off my feet.
Doesn't sound very comfortable.
Let's
I wasn't here on Mondays.
Let's
like,
stay
all
at
everything.
Oh, I see.
All right, so last call for questions before I collect this. All right. Then make sure your name is on it and do your best to tear it out of your workbook and I'll come pick it up.
Oh my goodness, I'm gonna get 110%.
My name's on there.
Okay, got it.
One time, I tore a page out of the book and ended up in a page and a half.
One time I closed an entire car door on my hand and it latched, so my dad had to come around and do it because it wouldn't undo from the inside. And my dad said he walked around and it was just my poor fingers doing this.
Doing what?
Doing this.
Yeah, you going?
We just got done deer hunting actually. Just now.
Oh,
Yeah.
boy.
Hopped into my dad's 1997 Escort station wagon and just thought, you know what would be funny if I smashed my fingers. And I don't even know how I did it because I like got in and then shut the door and had my just held my hand. in.
All right, thank you.
I'm not like it was
You're on
weird.
the inside?
Yeah. And it wouldn't open from the inside because of the way that it latched shut. So I like my dad had to run around and open it. And he's like, open the door and I'm like, it's not opening. Did break actually.
That makes it seem a lot more interesting
Yeah.
if you're on the inside.
Well, yeah.
It'd be pretty funny, wouldn't it?
What, did you think I just slammed my hand to the outside of the door?
Some people, they like pull a door closed, they accidentally put their hand in the way and they're like.
Yeah, those people are idiots, okay? I impressed. I must have
Talented.
slammed
Talent
it.
and skill.
Talent, skill, and the ability to slam my hand in court.
I had practice, I've done it before.
Well, now I don't have feeling in my hands, so when I'm at parties, I'll be like, yeah, no, straight up just take that mug there and smash it on my hand. And then they do it. It's a good time.
So have you closed your hand in a car door since?
No, I've been very mindful of how I get to vehicles after they're doing that. What does oblique mean?
All right, so today we're going a little further to talk about part writing and some of the guidelines, some of the customs, some of the traditions that we need to know in order to part write successfully, I should say, yes, successfully and correctly. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to talk about 5 types of motion that are possible between any 2 pair of voices when you go from one chord to another and you part write. Now, why do we need to talk about types of motion? Well, there are 2 main reasons or 2 main principles why we even bother studying voice leading and part writing. Okay? Number 1, we want to be able to control and promote smooth motion of the notes in each voice as they move from one chord to the next. And you don't have to write that down or anything, but we want to be able to control the motion of the notes. We want to be able to promote smooth motion of the notes as they go from one chord to the next. And again, smooth, when I say that, I mean not a lot of large leaps. Not a lot of large leaps. The second main reason we study voice leading is because we need to maintain the relative independence of the individual voices. A big emphasis that composers of the tonal era put on their part writing was they wanted the voices to be relatively independent, to kind of do their own thing. If all 4 voices are moving the same direction by the same distance and in the same way all the time, it gets a little bit boring, it gets a little bit monotonous. Okay? So we want to have the voices kind of doing their own thing, but still making good chords in the process, good harmonies. So, because of those reasons, a good musician has to be keenly aware of the types of motion occurring between any 2 voices of a 4-voice texture at all times. At all times. And let's go ahead and take a look at the different combinations or the possible pairs of voices that we can have in a 4-voice texture. So if I just take any 2 voices out of these 4 and look at them, just isolate 2 voices at a time, couldn't I pick, for instance, the soprano and the alto? That's a pair. Okay? I'm going to just abbreviate it SA. Another pair of voices that we could look at the motion between would be the soprano and the tenor. Right? Another pair of voices would be the soprano and the bass. Another pair of voices I haven't listed yet would be the alto and the tenor. We could look at their motion. We could look at the motion between the alto and the bass. And there's one other pair I haven't gotten to yet. Which pair is that?
The bass and the tenor.
The bass and the tenor, that's right. So it turns out that in a 4-voice texture, we have 6 unique or 6 different pairs of voices that we need to be concerned about what type of motion are these voices moving in. What type of motion are they producing as you go from one chord to the next? Because some types of motion promote independence among the voices, but other types of motion detract from the amount of independence among the voices. And we're going to look at the 5 types of motion possible between any pair of voices, and then after that I'll ask you, you can tell me which ones you think promote independence and which ones detract from independence. Okay? So up on the screen up here, this comes from page 74 in your textbook. I want to make it, I'm not going to show all 5 of them at once because then it's too small for you to see. But let's take a look at one of the 5 types of motion. Letter A, it's called static motion. This is really no motion at all. You see how with those 2 voices, a pair of voices there, soprano and alto, neither part moves as you go from the first half of the measure to the next half?
Yeah.
Static motion is really no motion at all. No part moves. They stay on the same pitches. Okay? Measure B. What is oblique motion? Well, oblique motion occurs when one of the parts moves to a different pitch, but the other part stays the same on the same pitch. So if I go to the piano and I play static motion, first of all, that's no motion at all, and it sounds like this. Okay? But oblique motion there will sound like this. Okay, you see how the soprano voice moved to another pitch as you go from the first half of the bar to the second half, but the alto voice stayed on the same pitch? When you have that pattern, that's called oblique motion between the two voices. Measure C, contrary motion. That occurs when you have two voices and both of them move, but they move in opposite directions. So for instance, we have the alto is going down, A to G. The soprano is going up, C to E. So together they're moving in opposite directions. We call that contrary motion. The reverse would also be true. If they start here and end up here. As long as you have two voices moving in the opposite direction, that's called contrary motion. There are two more types of motion, which let's take a look at. They're called, measure D says similar motion, and measure E is called parallel motion. Okay, so similar motion occurs when two voices move in the same direction, but by different intervals or by different amounts. You can see in that measure there that the soprano voice moves down, but just by a step, by a second, and the alto voice moves down, but by to a greater degree, right? It moves down on the fourth. Okay. So that's called similar motion. They're moving the same direction, but by different amounts or by different intervals. And finally, the last measure, we have something called parallel motion. Now, parallel motion is where two voices move in the same direction by the same generic interval. Okay? And here we're talking about two voices move down by a step, or two voices move up by a third, or down by a fourth. It doesn't have to be the exact same interval, like two voices move down, or one voice moves down by a perfect fourth, and the other moves down by an augmented fourth. That doesn't matter. Okay? It's just the generic interval, the size of the interval. So in measure E, you can see how the soprano moves down by a second, and the alto also moves down by a second. And when voices move in parallel motion like that, the interval that they form at the beginning of the measure, you see how A to C, that's a third? Yeah, that's the same interval that they're going to end up in relation to each other when they move in parallel motion, bless you. So G to B over on the right side, that's a third as well. So when voices move in parallel motion, they're going to start at a certain interval in relation to each other. They're going to move the same direction by the same amount. They're going to stay in the same interval relationship to each other wherever they end up. Does that make sense? So let me play these two measures quickly. You'll hear similar motion versus parallel motion. So similar motion is this. And parallel motion is nice. So that's all parallel motion. All right, so 5 types of motion, one of which isn't really even motion at all. Static motion is not even moving anywhere. Okay. Now, let me ask you this. Maybe I can shrink this so you can see all 5 of them in a little bit. Out of these 5 types of motion that are on the top of page 74 in your textbook, somebody tell me, pick one of these that you say would actually contribute to or create independence between voices. Say again? Okay, oblique motion, I would agree with you. That could produce independence between voices because one voice is moving and the other voice isn't. They're doing different things. How about another type of motion that contributes to independence?
Contrary motion.
Yeah, contrary motion, big time, right? They're not only doing different things, they're doing the opposite thing. Okay? They're moving in opposite directions. So contrary motion is a big independence creator. Is there another one that maybe contributes to independence?
Similar?
Yeah, I would say similar, could do a little bit of independent stuff. Again, they're not doing the exact same thing, so there's a little bit of independence factored in there. But if I asked you what type of motion detracts from or takes away from independence?
Parallel.
Yeah, well certainly static. In fact, static, we could say it's no motion at all. So, but besides static, definitely parallel motion. Parallel motion actually contributes to uniformity and sameness. And that's not really what we want when we write chords in 4 voices or in 4 parts. We want them to be independent, doing their own thing. So we get the full sound, the full 4-voice textural sound of a chord. We don't want them necessarily doubling each other as they move or doing the same thing. It's not very artistic, at least in this style. Okay? So, the moral of the story is we have to be very careful when we write or use parallel motion, any kind of parallel motion when we part write or voice lead chords in music. Parallel motion is the special type of motion we've got to be careful about. All the other types of motion, static, oblique, contrary, and similar, those can all be used freely whenever you need to. There's no restrictions against those types of motion. But certain types of parallel motion there are restrictions against. Okay? Now, let me go to this first measure on the board here, and let's just at least practice identifying or labeling the types of motion between various pairs of voices. And then after that, I'll get into specifics about the do's and don'ts of parallel motion. Okay? So let's take a look at these different pairs of voices in this first measure only. The soprano and the alto. See, they start here and they go to here. What type of motion is that? It's a little more than similar motion.
Parallel.
It's actually parallel motion, right? Because they're both going down by a second.
Oh, the space, yeah.
Yeah, they're both going down by the same amount. Okay? So that's parallel motion. What if I asked you what type of motion is exhibited between the soprano and the tenor voice? What would you say? Parallel motion again. Okay. How about the soprano and the bass voice? Now's the time for similar motion, right? The soprano is going down by a step, but the bass is going down by a beat. That's similar motion. Okay. Let's practice identifying some other types. How about the type of motion between the alto and the tenor voice? Parallel motion, right? Parallel motion, they're both going down by a second. How about between the alto and the bass? Similar motion, and between the tenor and the bass is also similar motion, okay? So there's not a whole lot of oblique or contrary. In fact, we didn't find any instances of oblique or contrary motion between any pair of voices in this measure. It doesn't mean the measure is like crap or anything like that. It just means that maybe it's not sounding as independent as it could. But there's actually nothing wrong with this measure. All right, so you got a little bit of practice identifying motion type between pairs of voices, looking at different pairs of voices. Now let's talk about the restriction on certain types of parallel motion. Yes?
I have a question.
Okay.
Which one of these is the most common?
Which one of these measures?
No, which one of the types of motion?
Oh, which one of the types of motion is the most common? I would say it's really hard to say. No books would really tell you. I would say oblique, contrary, and similar. Even some parallel, yeah. Static is probably the least common.
Okay.
But I would say you'd see oblique, contrary, similar motion pretty frequently. Yep. Okay, now, parallel motion. We said it detracts from independence, but certain types of parallel motion are allowed, and other instances of parallel motion are not allowed. And it all depends on the initial interval that the two voices you're comparing make at the start. Okay? In measure E up there, the two voices create a third, right? A to C. They move in parallel motion to different notes, and those different notes form a third as well, G to B. Motion by parallel thirds, fourths, and sixths is allowed in part rate. You're free to write any two voices and have them move in parallel motion in those intervals. That's allowed. So if I go back to this first measure, do you see how the soprano and alto are moving in parallel thirds? These two voices form a third, and then they end up forming a third again, and they're in parallel motion. That's allowed. And do you see how the alto and the tenor are moving in parallel motion, but the initial interval started as a fourth, right? G to C is a fourth. and then F to B is a fourth. So that's allowed too, parallel fourths are allowed. And yes, I do, and I even have an instance of parallel sixths. Let's take a look at the soprano and the tenor. It's not G to E a sixth, and then those two voices move parallelly, they just move down a step, so we end up with a sixth between those notes again in the new chord. So that's good motion there, that's allowed in part writing, parallel thirds, fourths, and sixths. Yes?
So for the other intervals, like if you had these that had, I guess, like parallel seconds, is that also acceptable or unacceptable?
Well, I would probably say mostly unacceptable, but I don't think there are really any hard and fast rules against that because the chords that we write are like triads and so forth, and so we're not going to be, there's not going to even be an option to write, a chance to write parallel seconds or sevenths, at least not in this tonal style. Now, if we were to talk about 20th century music in a dissonant style, then you'd have that option, and it would be allowed at that point. But yeah, there's really not going to be a lot of opportunities to write parallel seconds and sevenths. If there are, I would stay away from them, but we're not going to really, I think, come across that too often. Yeah. So that's why seconds and sevenths are left out of this over here on the board. Now, the motion of parallel intervals that are prohibited in this style of music are these: parallel unisons, fifths, and parallel octaves. You cannot write those that parallel motion at those intervals between any pair of voices. Now let me see if I can show you how you gauge that, or how you find that, or how you know what that means. Let's take a look at this second measure here. For instance, take a look at just the bottom two voices, the bass and the tenor. How far apart are the bass and the tenor?
Fifths.
A fifth, yeah. And we'll just go with that. They're actually, technically, they're a perfect fifth apart, right? C to G. Okay. Now, let's look in the next chord at how far apart are the bass and the tenor again.
Fifths.
Perfect fifth apart. Well, if they started on some notes where we're a perfect fifth, moved to different notes and ended up a perfect fifth apart, that means they must be moving in parallel motion. This is not geometry, but you understand, like if parallel lines move, they stay the same distance apart. Okay, anyway, so this is not allowed in part writing. We call this parallel perfect fifths. Parallel perfect fifths are never permitted in this style between any two voices.
Why is that?
Well, I'm glad you asked. The reason is because the fifth, and especially the octave and the unison, they are some of the most open and hollow sounding intervals that we have in music. Okay? So when you have two voices moving in parallel motion at those open, hollow sounding intervals, basically the text or the chords sound like there's open spaces or there's missing something. We don't have the full sonic sonority sounding that we could get if everything was moving in more independently. Okay? So, for instance, if I were to play just the bottom two voices of that middle measure there, it sounds like this. Yeah, and that's not stylistic in, we're talking about between like 1650 and 1900. This may be stylistic, in the Middle Ages, but it's not very stylistic in the tonal era that we're studying here.
So you're saying we're not allowed to do it because of the time period we're studying?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with the stylistic customs. That's right. And what happens if I play just, for instance, the bass and the alto voices in that middle measure? Do we get a lot of variety? Do we get a lot of sonic, differences, or do we get a lot of the same thing? Yeah, we get a lot of the same thing. In fact, what is the interval between the bass and the alto at this point? A perfect octave, that's right. And notice how they move to different notes, and aren't the bass and the alto also at a perfect octave on different notes up here?
Yeah.
Over here. So in that case, we have parallel octaves. And that's definitely not allowed. Okay. So the entire chord progression sounds kind of, well, it's not very artistic, it just sounds plain. Now, to our 21st century ears, know, we're used to hearing. We're used to hearing all that parallel motion. But back in this time, in this style, that was a no-no. Okay, you didn't want that. You wanted to be more creative, more artistic, have the voices move differently, be independent, and still produce the chords that you want. That was kind of the goal of the music. Yes.
If you score 80 to the final, can you play the entirety of that song for us?
I'll think about that, doing it when I'm 80. How's that? How old will you be when I'm 80? I don't know.
I'll probably be dead.
No, you don't. Yes.
So you made a point to say perfect fifth for that. Does it matter if
My
it's
lip roll.
perfect, too perfect, if like you're on perfect to diminished fifth? Is that?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm going to reserve that for about the last 5 minutes of class.
Okay.
Yeah, remind me if I don't get to that.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so parallel unisons, parallel fifths, parallel octaves between any two voices are not allowed. Let me see if I can say it, I don't know, another way or some way that's clearer. Okay, because perfect octaves and fifths and unisons are the most open and hollow sounding intervals, any pair of voices moving from one of these intervals to new notes forming these same intervals is unacceptable in the style we are learning. It's just unacceptable. All right, so let me, I'm going to do a couple more examples here and then try to clarify this and tell you what is still allowed, so that way you'll know what's not allowed. Let's take a look at the next measure here. In fact, let me use this red marker so it's a little better. Some of you might say, well, if I look at the, let's say I look at, well, we'll look at this. Is that an instance of bad parallel fifths? See how I have C to G in the first chord, and in the second chord, I have G to D. Is that wrong? The answer is no, it's not wrong. And do you know why?
As you said.
Yeah, because different parts are involved in the first chord and the second chord. See, for parallel fifths to be wrong, the same two voices have to have the parallel motion and create the fifths or the octaves in both chords. But see, here the fifth is between the bass and the soprano, and in this chord the fifth is between the bass and the alto. So it's like comparing apples and oranges. That's allowed. That's perfectly fine. Okay? So there is no issue here. No issue here. But you see back in this measure, the bass and the tenor created a fifth, and then the bass and the tenor also created a fifth. So that's definitely wrong, parallel motion, because it involves the same two voices in both chords. Both chords. All right, I got one more example that, I don't know why I used a double bar here. Maybe I was going to get something else on there. Let me give you this last example. See if you think that this is bad parallel fifths or good part rate. Here, here, and here, and here. Okay. Now, one of the tricks to good part rating is being able to look at all the different pairs of voices and determine if any of these pairs of voices have parallel motion. If any of these pairs of voices have static, oblique, contrary, similar motion, they're totally fine. You don't have to worry about it. You haven't committed an error. But if any of these pairs of voices have parallel motion, and the motion, parallel motion, is at these three one of these three intervals, I have to take a lot of points off the paper. And I'll go. So let me ask you this. We'll look at this. Is this bass and alto? Is that parallel octaves? Is that not allowed? It's actually good. It is allowed. Why is that allowed? Say again? Yeah, because the motion is static, not parallel. That's right. The motion, there's no motion at all actually between the bass and the alto. It's that for parallel octaves and fifths to be bad, the notes that create a fifth or an octave in one chord, they have to move to new or different notes and form that same interval between the same two voices in the next chord. And that's wrong. That's wrong. But this is static motion. Nothing wrong with static octaves or fifths. Nope. Nothing wrong with all of those. Yeah, well, no, that's something I'll talk about that. Okay, now, let me put up one measure here that's an example that gives a bad, an instance of bad parallel unisons. Parallel unisons. Some space here. Okay. So we have C. And we have Okay. Now, between which two voices do I have parallel unisons? The bass and the tenor. Where's my red one? This is not permitted. In fact, you could mark this incorrect. You could mark the error by just somewhere in here. Whoops, writing parallel unisons. I'm going to go play this measure on the piano, and I mean, it's not going to sound bad to our ears, but it's going to sound like a 3-voice texture rather than a full 4-voice texture. Why? Because the bass and the tenor are doing the exact same thing. You can't distinguish among them. And when do basses and tenors ever do the exact same thing? Never, right? So we have this sound. Well, that's nice if you want a 3-voice texture, but for a 4-voice texture, it stinks. You don't have the full power, the full sonority of all 4 voices at your disposal. Also, there's another parallel error going on here between another pair of voices. Can you find that?
Altos. No.
Well, okay, what is the interval for alto and soprano? They are only in parallel. 6 though. Parallel 6 are fine. But I see it's still an objectionable.
The bass and tenor with the alto.
That's right. This voice here, whichever one you want, tenor bass with the alto, what interval is that? C to G, perfect fifth. A to E, perfect fifth. So this is bad too. Not only do we have parallel unisons, we also have parallel fifths. There's not a whole lot of independence going on. When you have all those combinations of voices, not a whole lot of independence going on. You're not maximizing the forces at your disposal, so to speak. All right, let's take a look at one other example, and then I'm going to get to the unequal fifths that he was talking about. So let's try this. Okay. How about start up here? Look at this second measure here. I hope you can see, well actually I should put a piece in between. I hope that you can see that there is an instance of bad parallel fifths between the bass and the tenor in this example. Now, I know this is logical, it makes sense in my mind, and you might say, well, okay, if I can't write that parallel fifths, why can't I just do this thing to fix the problem? Yeah, okay. Yeah, what have I done? Instead of parallel fifths now, I have A to E still is a perfect fifth, D to A is still a perfect fifth. I have what's called contrary fifths. There's still fifths, perfect fifths, between the same pair of voices that have gone to new notes in both chords. Instead of parallel motion, though, this time they're arrived at by contrary motion. And that is actually frowned upon. It is said you can't fix your parallel fifths that way because you're still going to have that open sounding hollow fifth going to another open sounding hollow fifth through the same pair of voices.
So is it the same thing if you crossed the, I guess, harmony? So it's like on the second chord there, if you just swap the stems around and made the tenor voice be the lower voice?
Oh, in other words, you did something like.
Yeah, just literally that way.
Okay, number one, from last class, you're not supposed to have any voice go below the bass.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to cross voices.
So
And
let's
number-
say it's alto and soprano.
Yeah, well, either way, in this case, you're having the tenors leap from an E all the way down to a D. That's a pretty big leap to sing. And you're having the bass, well, the basses are going up an octave, which isn't bad. But that's very hard to sing, and if it crosses voices, that would not be acceptable either. So you have to do this, which leaves you with, unless you rework or revoice the whole chord, you're still going to end up with contrary fifths here. Yeah. And contrary fifths or contrary octaves are not allowed either. Okay. Let me see if I can show you some examples out of the book. That, I don't know, I'll play them at the piano and see what your ear thinks. Again, our daily 21st century ears we accept quite a bit nowadays, but back in this time period, it wasn't very cool to do this kind of thing. All right, so I'm going to look at example 515. Now you can see in measure A and B, both of those measures have bad instances of parallel motion. Measure A has parallel fifths between the bass and tenor. Measure B has parallel octaves between the bass and soprano. So not a whole lot of independence going on here. And again, it won't sound too bad to our ears, but back in the time, it was not good to do this. Because if I just isolate and play the bass and the tenor, it sounds like this. Not very artistic, not very good. Okay? If I play measure B, now it sounds like this. But if I take away the inner voices and just play the outer voices, I get this sound. There's more artistic ways to get all those notes in there. There's better ways to have all the voices move independently and still get the notes you need. And that happens in measure C. Listen to this one. Okay? No bad parallel motion in there at all. That would be something that would be very singable, it would be writable, it would be something that you could perform like in a choir, for instance. I'm not making this stuff up. I know it seems like, wow, these are really strange, stringent little restrictions, it seems kind of arbitrary. Well, no, this is just the way the style was back then. It developed into an art form kind of thing, so that you can really appreciate, but when you listen to good music, you can really appreciate that the composer of this style knew what he or she was doing, and they made it all work out just right with the maximum number of voices and independence and all that going on. Yes?
So if you wrote a song that used A or B, other than theory notes telling you you're wrong, what is the repercussion there? Does it just there's not really a repercussion, especially if you're writing a modern song like today. But for instance, I was always told as a student that you've got to learn how to do things proper and right and according to the rules, according to the tonal style first, and then after you know the rules and can follow them, and then you graduate, then you can do whatever you want. But that's what I've had professors tell me before. They say, well, you gotta be able to do the proper way. You gotta be able to do that first, and then if you consciously know you're breaking rules, that's a little different than if you're just ignorant of the rules. Okay. So yeah. All right. So let's take a look at another example. How about example 517 on the bottom of page 75? Let's see here. This shows you that parallel fifths cannot be corrected by writing contrary fifths. It still has the same open or hollow sound between the voices. So if I play the two measures of this example, you see in measure A, you have parallel fifths between the bass and the tenor. And then in the next measure, it's still toward to write contrary fifths. So the first measure sounds like this, which isn't bad to our ears, but if I take the tenor and bass apart, not good. You can't fix it by doing this either. Because now your bass and tenor are doing this. Not so good. Don't worry, we're getting there. Level 519. Yeah. Is this making you seasick?
Hey, it's a thing I talked about.
Yes, it is. That's right. Okay, now, if you want to know, I'm gonna have to tell you a rule in part writing that is like the most persnickety splitting hairs. Well, you might think, wow, this is the most ridiculous rule I've ever heard of. But it holds true in part writing in this style, so I'm gonna tell it to you anyways. There's this thing in music called unequal fifths. And let me change the chord here to show you an instance of what that would be. Well, I'll just do one of my own here, let's see. Now you might say, well, I see parallel fifths between the bass and the tenor in this measure. And you would cite these notes right there. But I would say, I disagree. They're not exactly parallel perfect fifths all the way, are they? Because these two notes form a perfect fifth. And it seems like they move in parallel motion. Well, what is this interval over here between the same two voices, technically? It's a diminished fifth. Yeah, don't worry about it. Don't worry about the other things that are wrong, okay? I'm just trying to illustrate something here. When two voices that start off with forming a perfect fifth, go to new pitches that form a diminished fifth, we say that those are not perfect parallel fifths. We have a special name for them, and they're called unequal fifths. Unequal fifths. The reverse is also an example of unequal fifths. So if you have two voices that start with a diminished fifth and then move to a perfect fifth, that's also unequal fifths. As long as one of your fifths is perfect and one of your fifths is diminished, they are not considered exactly parallel and perfect. They're called unequal fifths. All right, now, this gets to the real, what you might think is a ridiculous rule. Back in the day, some composers came up with this interesting restriction, and they said, you know what, I like the sound of two voices starting with a perfect fifth and then going to a diminished fifth, but I don't like the sound of the reverse. They said, I don't like the sound of a diminished fifth going to a perfect fifth. So some composers back in the day ruled out unequal fifths in this order. That is, starting with the diminished, then moving to the perfect. But they were okay with the reverse. As long as the perfect fifth comes first and then the diminished fifth, that was fine.
Was it any like variation of this, like get augmented manual perfect? Would they be cool with that? Or would that
Yeah, they didn't mess around too much with the augmented fifth. I think because the augmented fifth will sound like a minor sixth.
Fair enough.
Okay, so some composers said, none of this. And then there were other composers back in the day that said, you know what, I'm okay with any unequal fifths that happen up in the upper part of the texture, but if the bass is involved in creating some of those unequal fifths, I don't like it. I refuse to do that. Okay? So some composers back in the day said unequal fifths were fine unless the bass is involved in creating those intervals. So this is what our author has slyly done, cleverly done. Our author has said, well, we're going to take the best of both worlds. We're going to say that unequal fifths are acceptable unless a diminished fifth goes to a perfect fifth in that order and the bass is involved. Isn't that weird? That's like the most specific rule I think you've ever come across, at least in this music. So, in this case, the unequal fifths would be okay. I know the bass is involved, but why are these unokay? Because the perfect fifth comes first.
I think they the C, they're not even saying that, they just say avoid.
Yeah. So take a look at measure A there. Why are all those unequal fifths, perfect fifth to diminished fifth, why is that okay? And then why is diminished fifth to perfect fifth okay in the same measure? Well, the first one's okay because the order is reverse of this, and that would be correct. The second set is okay because diminished fifth to perfect fifth is okay as long as the base doesn't enter into the equation. Isn't that weird? But that's what they're saying. Why is in measure B, why is the set pair of unequal fifths between the base and soprano, why is that acceptable? Come on, you know why.
It's not bad with the base.
It's because it's not this order.
Yeah.
This is the bad order when the diminished fifth comes first and goes to a perfect fifth. But that's not what we have in B. In measure C, that one is bad because not only do we have the backwards order, diminished fifth first going to perfect fifth second, but the base is involved.
So if I wanted to fix, okay, that's not a great plan, but if you wanted to fix moving parallel fifths, could you just make it fourths? Just do the inversion?
Right, yeah, you can, if you can get away with turning those two voices that create the parallel fifths upside down, then you'll have parallel fourths instead, and those are allowed.
All right, solid.
Yeah. So let me play the last three measures here, for example, 519. And again, I don't know if your ear's going to hear a lot of difference, but measure A is good all the way. It sounds like this. In fact, if I isolate the alto and tenor, those aren't exactly perfect fifths all the way across. One of them's a diminished fifth. Letter B, measure B is fine as well. The outer voices. I think composers were okay with the perfect fifth coming first, because the diminished fifth can then resolve to a third. But measure C is bad because you go the wrong direction. And we have this sound. Diminished fifth. It is kind of weird. Don't get too hung up on the unequal fifths, though. The main thing for the homework is being on the lookout and spotting these ones. These are the really bad ones. Okay, these are the ones where you lose buku points on your assignment. If you write for them.
I always kind of a question.
Yes.
It doesn't reset at measure, does it? It's a stupid question, but I was kind of curious.
It doesn't what?
It doesn't reset at a measure, so if you have one that goes across a measure.
Right. It's
Okay.
still bad if you have parallel fifths. Yeah, going across a bar line.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still bad. Still bad. So, all right, let's take a look. On page 39 and 40. 39, you'll be able to do that section, I think, no problem. It just asks you to identify motion, types of motion. But on page 40, you're going to look at these two examples, and you're going to look between among all the different pairs of voices in the texture, and you're going to see if you can find these errors, like parallel fifths, parallel octaves, contrary fifths, spacing errors, things like that. The only thing I want you to change, and I put this in the assignment sheet, is as follows. There's a couple of them that say look for a direct fifth or a direct octave. Just completely cross that out and ignore it. Because your book talks about that, but I don't feel it's necessary to cover in this class, and I'm never going to talk about it in this class. So just cross out direct fifth and direct octave and look for the rest of the errors. Okay? And that's really all the time I have for today. Any questions? No, get me out of here.
One of my pins fell apart, so